So there's a guy named Bob who used to go golfing every Saturday. And one Saturday, he came home about 3 hours late. And his wife said, "My gosh, I was so worried about you. Why are you so late? What happened?" He said, "Oh, it was just a horrible day." He said, "We teed off the first tee. Charlie hit a hole-in-one. And then he fell of a heart attack and died." And she said, "Oh my gosh, that must have been horrible." And he said, "Yes, it was. The rest of the day, it was hit the ball, drag Charlie. Hit the ball, drag Charlie." Bad joke. But when we're talking about forgiveness, it's sort of like that. We keep dragging those things behind us, right? We don't let them go. We don't let them go. And so I want to talk about forgiveness today, and maybe next week as well. And the reason forgiveness came up for me this week is because last week we had a guest speaker. Charles Holt was here speaking and singing and did a great job, and he did a workshop, and he talked about his relationship with his father and his process of forgiveness of his father, and he wrote about it in a book. And he did a workshop on forgiveness that he worked with people in the group. And so it really brought up for me a lot of questions about forgiveness and what is forgiveness and how do we do it? How do we do it? I think it's sometimes like the Nike slogan, "Just do it." People say, "Just do it," and I think sometimes it's not that easy. At least has been my experience that it's not that easy to forgive, even though it's so important. So today I want to share a little bit about some thoughts I have about forgiveness and some thoughts that other great thinkers have had about forgiveness. Marshall Rosenberg in Nonviolent Communication, and I've been reading a book by Desmond Tutu and his daughter Mpho Tutu. That is the book of forgiveness. So I'm going to be using some of that in my talk today about how important it is for us to forgive. Because what T.D. Jakes, many of you are familiar with Bishop T.D. Jakes. He's the founder of the Potter's House in Dallas. There's several campuses in Dallas. There's also a campus here in Denver now of the Potter's House. He wrote a book called Let It Go. And in that book he says, unforgiveness, unchecked, becomes a cancer in our soul. Unforgiveness unchecked becomes a cancer in our soul. And he goes on to say what he meant by that was when we talk about cancer, that cancer in our body will eat up healthy cells. It will take over. And it doesn't stay in one place, right? If we don't treat it, if we don't check it in some way, if we don't examine it, that it can take over. And he says that unforgiveness can act in very much the same way, that it becomes a cancer in our soul because it eats away at our vitality. It eats away at our life energy. It affects every aspect of our lives, whether we know it or not. That when we're holding on to those states of unforgiveness, that it affects our relationships. One thing that Charles said in his workshop that I really appreciated was he said, "You are contagious. You are contagious. And if you're holding on to unforgiveness, your unforgiveness infects everybody in your life. Your children, your spouse, your coworkers, your boss, your church community. Every relationship you have can be affected by those states of unforgiveness." And so unforgiveness, in my understanding, is any thought, feeling, mind energy that is any way related to guilt or blame or shame or resentment or criticism or condemnation. any of those thoughts or feelings that we have about someone else or about ourselves. Today I'm focusing mostly on others, forgiveness of others. And I would say to us, because some people say, well, I don't have anything to forgive. Well, good for you. I want you to teach me. But when I think about unforgiveness, I'm thinking about not just the big things, that happened in our lives, the things that really stimulated a lot of pain, but I'm talking about even the little things. That somebody cutting us off in traffic, or somebody saying something that we think is rude to us in a grocery store, or, I have to practice forgiveness for all the people that leave their shopping carts in the parking lot. That's one of my pet peeves. So anything that stimulates resentment, anger, fear, blame, shame, is something for us to look at, to forgive. And our spiritual tradition, our Christian tradition, and I think all spiritual traditions teach the importance of forgiveness. I know in the Christian tradition, forgiveness is a very important aspect of what we teach. Jesus said in the story where he's talking about, and this is from Matthew, this is in the Sermon on the Mount, which really is a encapsulation, really, of all that Jesus taught. And he says in that chapter 5, beginning in verse 21, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder. And whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you," I love it when Jesus said that, "I say to you," let's look at it a different way, "that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to counsel. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny." Now that sounds awful, doesn't it? That Jesus would say, we're condemned to hell or we're condemned to prison until we pay the last penny. Well, we look at things a little more metaphysically than that, right? And so when we look at it metaphysically, really what Jesus is saying, or one way to interpret what Jesus might be saying, is that if we're holding those states of unforgiveness, because that's what we're talking about today, that it's not that someone else outside of us is going to take us into prison or is going to punish us, but that we are punished, we experience the fire of hell in our own consciousness because we are hanging on to those states of unforgiveness. And if we don't let them go, then they will imprison us. And we will not be set free from a prison of our own making until we have let it go. Until we have let it go. That's a powerful teaching. Because if the accuser is in your own mind, and so it's important for us then to clear it up. Whatever it is. What is forgiveness? I found this from George Lomsa, who went back to the original Aramaic and reinterpreted the Bible. And what he says about this is that in the Aramaic, the word that we have translated and shortened to forgive has a deeper and more expanded meaning. If we look directly at the direct translation of the Lord's Prayer from Aramaic to English, we can get a better understanding. Untie the tangled threads that bind us, as we release others from the entanglements of past mistakes. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Untangle that which binds us to the past. Untangle that which binds us to the other person. Untangle that which binds us to our own resentment and blame and guilt. So forgiveness in the original Aramaic really means to untie those binds, to open it up. And what I like about the way I look at forgiveness is that forgiveness restores us to our original state of being in the flow of divine love, who we really are, realigning us with our true nature, to be the expression of love for ourselves and for others in the world. Divine love. Now, this came up in the workshop last week. Somebody said, well, do I have to love somebody to forgive them? And what I want to say about that is when I'm talking about love, I'm not talking about feelings of affection or wanting to be close to somebody. I'm not talking about that emotional kind of love. Because I think you don't have to even like somebody to forgive them because you're not doing it for them. You're doing it for you. And so when I'm talking about love, I'm talking about being in that place, getting back to the place, or getting to a place where we can recognize our shared humanity and our shared divinity. Where we can recognize our shared humanity and our shared divinity. And I think from my understanding, that is being in a place of love, where we're clearing away the stuff. Because the way I look at it, it's like we're talking about the knots, untying the knots. Because unforgiveness becomes these knots that reside in our energy field. They become these knots that in our gut or in our heart that block the flow of love, that keep us from being in the flow of that divine love for other people and for ourselves. But it's like, you can feel it, can't you? You feel that when you're resentful or when you're angry or when you're blaming or even when you feel shame about something that you tell yourself that you're bad or wrong or guilt. You can feel it, right? Feel it in your gut or feel it in your heart. We experience it. And so forgiveness, as I want to talk about it today, is like untying that. So how do we do that? And again, I just want to acknowledge the book of Desmond Tutu's book, the Book of Forgiveness, and Marshall Rosenberg's book, Nonviolent Communication. I'm kind of blending them a little bit today. So just do this, if you will. Hold your fist like that in front of your heart. Do you feel that? Do you feel the tension of it? Clasp it really hard, until your fingernails just dig into your palm. Do you feel the pain of that? Do you feel the tension of that? Do you feel what that feels like? That is what unforgiveness feels like. Now let it go. Feel how it feels to be relaxed and open in that place. So that's what we want to get to, that place of openness. And so in order to do that, here is a way I want to share with you today. First of all, it requires our willingness. Willingness. And I want to say willingness to be free, because it's about us being free. It's not about letting somebody off the hook. It's not about condoning anything that anybody else did. It's about setting ourselves free. Because as I said before, that unforgiveness blocks the flow of our life energy. It can block our creativity. It can block the energy that comes back to us as our financial good, as our relationships. So our willingness to forgive is first. Are we willing to do something for ourselves, to free ourselves? And in his book, Desmond Tutu talks about this, the importance of telling what happened. Tell what happened as clearly as you possibly can, with as much detail as you possibly can. Now, Marshall Rosenberg would call this observation. You're not telling what happened with all of your evaluations, with all of your judgments, with all the things you put on it, but just what happened. I know I'm using a very simple, innocuous example today, and I know that there are many heavy things that many of us have in our lives, unforgiveness with people. So I just want to say I'm using something very small, even the parking lot thing, the shopping carts in the parking lot. My observation is that somebody left, there's a parking, I could just say there is a cart in the parking space in the parking lot. Period. That's what happened. Period. I don't know who left it there. But guess what happens in my head? Some idiot, some lazy jerk, somebody that doesn't care about me or anybody else left their cart in my space. Right? So tell what happened without all the other stuff that goes along with it. And then identify the feelings. Identify the feelings that go along with that, what you're telling yourself. Of course, for me, it's frustration, it's anger, it's resentment, all of those things that come up, that how could somebody be so inconsiderate, that kind of thing. And I want to say, Desmond Tutu in his book shares this from Father Lapsley, who is a priest in South Africa during apartheid. And he was the victim of a letter bomb. And as a result, he lost both of his hands and one sight in one of his eyes. And he went through this process of forgiveness. There's some amazing stories in that book. I highly recommend that book. We don't have it in our bookstore yet, but I highly recommend the book. And what Father Lapsley said is that we can't let go of feelings that we don't own. We can't let go of feelings that we don't own. And then Desmond Tutu says, we give voice to our hurts, not to be victims or martyrs, but to find freedom from the resentment, anger, shame, or self-loathing that can fester and build inside us when we do not touch our pain and learn to forgive. And that's another piece. So our willingness, tell what happened, identify the feelings, and feel the feelings. How many of us want to avoid that? I don't want to feel those feelings I don't really like feeling. If I want to feel resentment, I want to feel anger, I don't want to feel sad, I don't want to feel any of that. But it's important to feel the feelings. And I'm talking about feeling the emotion of it, and also feeling it in your body. For us to move past it, we have to move through it. And you've heard me talk about that before. This thing that we do sometimes in New Thought is that we want to be so spiritual. It's not spiritual to be angry. It's not spiritual. I'm spiritual, by God. I don't feel angry. I've been there. That's what we call a spiritual bypass. Right? Let's go around that stuff. But it's important to feel it. Be willing. Tell what happened. Identify the feelings and feel the feelings. And then fourthly, it is identifying, and I'm going to say, I see Kathy back there, and she's an NVC certified trainer. So I'm going to say this is probably not quite in alignment with what Marshall Rosenberg says, but I'm going to say Ask your heart, what aspect of my humanity or my divinity am I telling myself I'm being deprived of? What aspect of my humanity or my divinity am I telling myself I'm being deprived of in that situation? Now, in my simple, innocuous demonstration, my example of the shopping cart, I'm telling myself that the person is not being respectful of me or anybody else, that they're not considerate of me or anybody else. And so I want to be respected, I want to be considered, and when those things happen, and again, I want to say, I know there's some deeper stuff in there where we want safety, we want to be loved, we want peace, we want joy, we want all of those ideas and concepts that the divine represents for us. So be willing. Tell what happened. To identify what you're feeling or what you were feeling at the time. Feel what you were feeling or what you're feeling at the time. And then ask your heart, what is it I need? What is it I needed, wanted? Marshall talks about those as universal needs. I like to talk about them as aspects of our divine nature that we all want to experience, we all want to have reflected back to us. And then, what Desmond Tutu says in his book, and then he just says, grant forgiveness. Just grant forgiveness. Well, what I want to say is, don't move on until you have fully done your work. What did Jesus say to Peter when Peter said, if my brother offends me, how many times do I have to forgive him? 7? That sounds like a good number, right? And Jesus said, no, 70 times 7. 70 times 7. Or in other words, as much as it takes. Do it as often and as much as it takes to get through telling what happened, to be heard, to feel your feelings, to identify what was going on in there that was so important to you. And then, once you are free, once you have done those steps, and you're ready, only when you're ready, do the same thing with the other person. That's sometimes the hardest part. Sometimes the hardest part is not just to say blanketly, I forgive you, but to also be willing to see their humanity and their divinity, to be willing to look at what happened. And here is the kicker. To guess what they might be feeling or what they might have been feeling when they did that thing or said that thing. I mean, that jerk at the grocery store who left their their shopping cart out there. No, I'm just kidding. Again, it's an easy example, but maybe they were in a hurry. Maybe they needed some efficiency. Maybe they had 4 kids they were dragging along with them, and they couldn't take the time to go back in the grocery store. Can I have empathy for them? What might they be feeling? Hurried, overwhelmed. Maybe that's all they could do. And so what were they needing as well? What did they want? What were they valuing, And again, can I see? I think for me, forgiveness ultimately is about recognizing my own humanity, my own divinity, and being willing to behold that in the other person. And truly, until I get there, I'm not free. I am not free. Because that knot is still there. So it has to be both. And it's very important that we do the work. of forgiveness. So I would suggest that you go home and make a list of all the people. I was watching, I don't remember what it read, I can't remember now where it came from. Oh, it was Edwene Gaines talks about forgiveness quite a bit in her book. She says that once a year, she takes quiet time, a day, and she goes back through her entire life and recalls anyone that she might be holding any level of intensity of unforgiveness for. And she does the work. Now, her work is a little different than what I was describing, but it is a different path. And so it's important, truly important, because if we don't forgive, again, it's energy that we hold on to. And you know that energy affects us. Energy affects us. And so if we don't forgive, if we're holding on to unforgiveness, you know, the part that I hate about it is that it affects premature aging. It affects our bodies. It affects our bodies. It triggers the stress response, you know, and the body does all sorts of things when it's under stress. Eventually, if we don't forgive, if we don't work through it, then our bodies become sick. And that's not the only cause of sickness, I know that, but it puts us in that place of vulnerability. So, importance of forgiveness. How to forgive. And if you'd like more information about that, I will be glad to share it with you. I didn't give you anything in writing, but just to share that with you at some point. And I think next week I'm going to talk a little bit more about forgiveness of self, because I think that's one of the hardest things that we do. How do we forgive ourselves for things that we might have done or said that caused others to feel pain? So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but really just to share with you some of the thoughts about forgiveness, because it is a tenet of our faith, of all faiths, I think. It is a process that frees us. It frees us. You don't do it for anyone else. You don't do it for God. You don't do it for the other person. You do it for you. It's not always easy. It takes great courage. It takes great courage sometimes to tell what happened and to feel those feelings and to identify what was going on for you. It takes great courage. And it's not fast always either. It takes as long as it takes. It takes as long as it takes. But it's worth it. It's worth it. So I encourage you this week to make that list. See what comes up. You might be surprised. You might be surprised.